Well, hello everybody, welcome. This is the second video in our Prison of the Ism series. Now, if you haven't watched the first video, I'd encourage you to do so. It's on our website and YouTube channel, and that video is really an introduction to this series. As I mentioned in that introductory video, this is going to be a 10-part series. We're going to look at the issue of Marxism right through from the 1920s right through until the 2020s. And really, if you want to understand the age that we are in, if you want to understand why and what's happening in 2020, you really need to understand what happened in 1920. That is how fundamentally key an understanding of the past 100 years is to the culture that we find ourselves in for today. So if you haven't checked out the first video, I'd encourage you to do so. It's an excellent introduction into the series. And today, finally, we begin in the 1920s. Now, you say the 1920s to most people, and immediately what they'll think of is the Roaring Twenties. I'm sure that many of you have heard of the phrase. Now, for America in particular, it was a period of dramatic social and political change. And the nation's wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. And Americans were swept into becoming what was known as the consumer society. Now, we know the consumer society exists in an even more rabid method today. Australia's economy wasn't as buoyant during that period. We here experienced high inflation from 1919 to 1920, followed by a severe recession until 1923. And in the mid-1920s, however, the economy began to recover, but not enough to withstand the Wall Street crash of 1929, which then led to a worldwide economic depression, which hit Australia really, really hard. During that time, the economy collapsed and unemployment reached a peak of 32% in 1932. But the 1920s was also known as a decade of intense social tension. Prohibition throughout America had led to burgeoning organised crime. Racial tensions ratcheted as African Americans relocated from the southern countryside to the northern cities. And as a result, millions of people in places like Indiana and Illinois actually joined the Ku Klux Klan. You see, to them in that period, the Klan represented a return to the so-called values that the fast-paced city slicker Roaring Twenties mob were trampling. Australia, thankfully, never quite went down the same road, particularly in terms of the racial tension, never went down the same road with prohibition. But in Australia, there was the infamous period of the 6 o'clock swill. And that was where men would guzzle as much booze between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. when the pubs were closing. Now, unfortunately, this wreaked havoc within homes as there was a significant uptick in domestic violence, family breakdowns and relationship troubles, all because of the alcohol consumption. If we look back in America, there was an anti-communist Red Scare in 1919 and 1920 that encouraged a widespread anti-immigrant hysteria. These conflicts, which one historian called a cultural civil war, became evident between city dwellers and small town residents. It was also apparent between Protestants and Catholics, blacks and whites, the new progressive women, as they were known, and the advocates of old-fashioned family values. But something else was brewing offshore, something that wouldn't affect America and the world immediately. It would come many decades later, but what it would bring, nobody was prepared for. Central to the story of Marxism over the past 100 years are two names, Antonio Gramsci and George Lukács. They concluded that the working class of Europe had been blinded by the success of Western democracy and capitalism. They reasoned that until both had been destroyed, a communist revolution was not possible. And in 1918, Lukács became Minister of Culture in Bolshevik Hungary. During this time, he realised that if the family unit and sexual morals were eroded, society could be broken down. The reason he pursued such radical ideas was that he and Gramsci both believed that the Christianised West was the obstacle to a communist New World Order. Gramsci said that Christianity had corrupted the working class and the West had to be de-Christianized by attacking certain institutions, beginning with the family and completely engulfing churches, schools, media, entertainment, civic organisations, literature and science. And in place of the historical truth, he went about presenting a revisionist version of history. Meanwhile, in Hungary, Lukács, who was then Commissar for Culture, developed what he called cultural terrorism. And one component of cultural terrorism was to develop sexual education courses in schools that would work to distort traditional morals. He came to the conclusion that if sexual morals in Christians could be compromised and undermined when they were children, then Christianity itself could be destroyed, leading to the collapse of Western civilization and therefore opposition to Marxist indoctrination. And he sought to accomplish this by highly criticising Christian sexual moral values in the classroom, while simultaneously then promoting sexual promiscuity. Furthermore, he also derided parental and church authority. And so with all of this happening, similar to the pattern of behaviour we see today, this had the effect of transforming children into bullies, petty thieves, sex predators, murderers and sociopaths. Now, thankfully, unlike today's society, who simply indulges this woke neo-Marxist leftism, the Hungarian working class became so enraged at Lukács' work that they drove him out of Hungary. What a wonderful thing for them to do. If only we could drive out this woke leftism that has eroded and corroded our society at the moment. You see, Lukács and Gramsci had similar goals but very different approaches. Gramsci believed that a new person must be culturally created before a socialist state could succeed. In other words, he reasoned that before communism could take hold, politically and economically, it had to take hold culturally. I'll say that again because it's important. He believed that before communism could take hold politically and economically, it had to take hold culturally. That is very important for you to understand in terms of what's happening in our culture today. In fact, Gramsci said this: "In the New World Order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches and the media by transforming the consciousness of society." And if he didn't quite make himself clear with that quote, he also said, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must kill Christianity." Do you get that? That is what Gramsci said. Socialism is the religion that must kill Christianity. People will tell you that socialism is just a political ideology. It is in part, but it's also a religion of the left, and that is why it's so dangerous. You see, Lukács, though, believed that existing cultural norms had to be destroyed in order to replace them with something new. He said this: "I saw the revolutionary destruction of society as the one and only solution. A worldwide overturning of values cannot take place without the annihilation of the old values and the creation of new ones by the revolutionaries." So, in effect, Marxists realised that Marxism cannot succeed in strongly Christian societies. Christianity is a bulwark against this type of rubbish. In 1923, the Institute for Marxism, based in Frankfurt, Germany, entered the picture. Well, that was the original planned name, but it gave the game away far too much. To conceal their true intentions, it became the much less threatening Institute of Social Research, popularly referred to as the Frankfurt School. Now, before we go any further, let me address the issue of modern Marxism, because this is essentially where it begins. 1923, the Frankfurt School. This is really where it gathers steam. But it is important to understand the historical context of the terms that we use in the modern language, because some can be considered anti-Semitic. And as a church and as Christians who love Israel, love the Jewish people, we don't want that. We don't want any connection with anti-Semitism whatsoever. Those on the right side of politics will often use the term cultural Marxism at the moment. But let me explain why, as a Christian, you should steer away from using the term cultural Marxism and instead use the term neo-Marxism. You may have heard of the Bolshevik Revolution. It occurred in 1917 and involved leftist revolutionaries led by Bolshevik Party leader Vladimir Lenin. It was a coup, but it was a bloodless one. It overthrew the provisional government, which had been assembled by a group of leaders from Russia's capitalist class. Lenin instead called for a Soviet government that would be ruled directly by councils of soldiers, peasants, and workers. Now, this led to Lenin becoming the dictator of the world's first communist state. Now, if you ever mention the word Jew and Bolshevism in the same sentence, tread carefully, because a lot of people believe this was a Jewish-led conspiracy. So be very careful when you use these phrases, Jew and Bolshevism. As I said, we don't want to appear anti-Semitic whatsoever. There are some who believe this theory, it was Jewish-led, but let's examine the facts. There were many Jews who did dominate government positions during the early Soviet years, and it is a fact that 6 of the 12 Bolshevik committee members who made the decision to seize power were Jewish. Facts. But it has been ably pointed out by many, particularly over the past 100 years, that these men were ethnically Jewish, but they were atheistic in nature. Now, that is in no way excusing any immoral or criminal actions that they committed. Unfortunately, as so often happens in a fallen world though, many have taken the opportunity to pursue an anti-Semitic position because they saw the revolution as largely a Jewish creation. Now, I don't believe the historical facts support that at all. It does not support any connection between the Bolshevik Revolution and some Jewish-led conspiracy. And if you look at a lot of the historians, most, if not all, deny that assertion as well. They deny the connection between some conspiracy led by the Jewish people and the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, when Hitler came to power, the Nazis, they believed that they faced an insidious assault on their family, their identity, their music, art, and intellectual life. And they called this attack cultural Bolshevism, named, of course, after the Marxist revolutionary movement in Russia by the Bolshevik Party, which we had just examined. So to the Nazis, Judaism and Marxism were synonymous. And therefore, they invented this conspiracy that Jews would do to Germany what they supposedly did to Russia. So, to many Jews, the term cultural Marxism is offensive because it connects them back to the original Bolshevik Revolution and it connects them into Nazi Germany because the Nazi Germans believed that there was a conspiracy there. They believe, once again, that anti-Semitic Westerners continue to blame them for every ill which besets society. And that's a very, very sad thing. There are so many conspiracies around the Jewish people at the moment. Now, as I said, as believers, we don't want to be promoting any type of anti-Semitism whatsoever. This series is not about attacking Jews whatsoever. It is about exposing a deliberate agenda which has sought to subvert aforementioned institutions to advance Marxist doctrines. It is not a Jewish-led conspiracy at all. So, in my view, a more accurate term, which I suggest should be used by conservatives, is neo-Marxism, because it removes any unintended anti-Semitic connections whatsoever. Neo simply comes from the Greek neos, which means new. So when you're saying neo-Marxism, you're essentially saying new Marxism. Now, for the uninitiated, Marxism was primarily concerned with economics. You might understand that in its background. So the primary goal of the Frankfurt School was to translate Marxism from economic terms to cultural terms. So by this time, the Frankfurt School consisted mostly of neo-Marxists who hoped for a socialist revolution in Germany. In fact, they were not only hoping for it, they were becoming frustrated that it hadn't happened already. They were looking at a so-called successful Bolshevik Revolution in the years prior and wondered why revolution was not advancing in a sophisticated and industrialised country like Germany. Remember, true Marxism concerns itself with economic inequality, and they saw that the Industrial Revolution was adding to a widening gap between capitalist elites and the poor working class. So, if their theory was right, every country should reach a tipping point where revolution had to be inevitable in order to address the inequality. So far as Germany was concerned, they essentially concluded that the people were too comfortable to realise that they were being oppressed. In fact, they concluded that culture and the media were the primary tools for oppressing the masses and the terrain upon which Marxists had to launch revolution in the West. They had determined that advanced countries would not adopt socialism by economics alone, and the success of the revolution depended on a culture war. Now, unfortunately, their grand experimentation with socialist revolution didn't materialise in the way that they envisioned in Germany. What they got instead was fascism in the form of the Nazi Party. Now, speaking of that horrible period of history concerning the Nazis, it was also in the 1920s that eugenics started to enter the mainstream, which of course the Nazi Party would introduce into its concentration camps under the guise of medical experiments. Now, you've probably heard the term eugenics before, but in order to bring some definition to it, it's a social movement that supports the supposed improvement of the human population via selective breeding and other means. It was originally developed by Francis Galton. You might know the name Francis Galton, but he was a cousin of a very famous historical character named Charles Darwin. And in fact, it's based upon Darwin's theory. And I repeat, theory. There is no fact behind evolution. We are creationists. We believe in a young earth theory. We believe that the God of heaven and earth created the earth in 6 literal days. Darwin came up with a theory of evolution, which unfortunately is taught as fact in today's world. The word eugenics literally means good birth, and it comes from a Greek word meaning well-born, of good stock, of noble race. And the goal of eugenics is to make the world, or in case of some nation states who are pursuing eugenics, make a country a better place by guiding the course of human reproduction and supposedly purifying the gene pool. So, in order to bring about this highly sought after purified gene pool, eugenicists advocate genetic screening, birth control, segregation, transhumanism, euthanasia, compulsory sterilisation, forced pregnancies and abortion. Now, it may surprise many people to know that eugenics was openly practiced in the early decades of the 20th century in many countries, even the United States. In fact, several state laws were passed allowing the forced sterilisation of institutionalised people. The laws were even challenged in the Supreme Court, but surprisingly survived. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote in part about the decision, and I quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." What an absolutely shocking statement in a country like the United States. Thankfully, after World War II, eugenics fell out of favour amongst the nations when the extent of Nazi atrocities became well known to the world. Well, I should correct that statement. It fell out of favour in certain situations. Sadly, eugenics still continues today under the mantra of choice, as we are told in the abortion industry. And for Americans at least, they can lay the blame at the feet of one lady. Ever heard the name Margaret Sanger? Look her up. Plenty of information out there on the internet. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood, who is America's largest abortion provider. and was a proponent and is a proponent of eugenics. Remember, eugenics does include abortion. It includes sterilisation, so it is still eugenics. Sanger had railed against what she called the reckless breeding of the unfit. In her book, Woman and the New Race, which was published in 1920, she wrote this: "The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." I'll say that again. This is her quote. "The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." Now, the left lauds Margaret Sanger as a hero. Why? When she had these horrible, horrible ideas. Hillary Clinton once said she was in awe of her. Barack Obama praised her legacy at a Planned Parenthood conference. The reality is she was a racist woman who chose the devil's work. She was evil. She had an evil heart and evil plans for the world. Hear what she had to say about our Indigenous population in Australia. She considered them compulsive rapists and the lowest known species of the human family, just a step higher than the chimpanzee in brain development. That is a despicable statement about anybody, let alone our Indigenous population. And so I say on behalf of our Indigenous population, I'm appalled by that statement. I'm appalled that anybody would put that in any book or make that statement at all. This woman was despicable. She was evil. And anybody else who says otherwise is a fool. And can I say, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and anyone else who lauds Margaret Sanger is a hero. Go back, see what she said, listen to what she said, look at the legacy she left the world. She was evil, despicable, and she deserves to have all of her books burned, taken off the shelves for the abhorrent views that she held. Now, proponents of eugenics believe that human intervention is required in order to bring about a master race. Now, this is at direct odds with God's love for all. Let's turn to the book of Acts, chapter 10, verse 34. "Then Peter opened his mouth and said, 'In truth, I perceive that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him.'" You see, God does not restrict any nation or ethnicity from the offer of salvation. Yet, social engineers want to usurp God's authority over life and death in order to create a self-defined master race. You see, racial discrimination and ethnic superiority go against God's nature, and wherever it is found, we must speak out against it. Eugenics is not commonly called by that name today, but the underlying philosophy is still present. For instance, when a possible genetic defect is diagnosed in an unborn child, some couples choose to abort the baby. Unborn children with Down syndrome are a prime example. In the United States, an estimated 67% of the unborn diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. In France, it is 77%. In Denmark, it is 98%. And in Iceland, nearly 100% of babies diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted. Now, the world can come up with all the fancy, non-threatening language they like. This is eugenics, and it should be outlawed. Because at the heart of it, aborting a baby because of an expected defect is simply disposing of a person they consider unfit or undesirable to live in this world. And when the nations proudly claim they are eliminating Down syndrome, they are not eliminating the defect, they are eliminating the people. There is a big difference. There is an evil difference, and it goes to the heart of mankind that works continually evil. This is why we need the offer of God's salvation, His mercy, His grace to turn around the heart of the wicked, to turn it from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. You see, eugenics, both historical and modern, is an immoral social engineering experiment which has no place in society in any age, in any generation. Listen to what Job said about the evil of his day in chapter 24, verse 14. The murderer rises with the light. He kills the poor and needy, and in the night he is like a thief. This is the role of the eugenicist, killing the poor and the needy, those who he deems unworthy to inhabit the earth. Evil people use the cover of darkness, and in our case, the cover of the support of the general public, politicians, lawmakers, to commit their foul deeds. So what should we do? What should we do? We need to shine our light. That's what we do. The dark is a friend to evildoers, so the light terrifies them. That's why the world wants to silence Christianity, because the light that comes through from the truth of believers terrifies them, because they can no longer operate when the light is shone upon them. John chapter 3 verse 20, for everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. And that is exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be shining the light of God's truth, of God's grace and mercy, but also of God's judgment, because God is going to judge. We need to shine that upon these evildoers. And as Ephesians 5:11 counsels, and have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather expose them. Don't go along with them. Expose them. Shine the light of God upon them. Let them come out from the dark, damp places they hide, so that we can shine a light on the evil that they commit. You see, friend, the problem with Marxism is that it wants to create men in the image of Marxist cronies, whereas the scriptures rightly declare we are made in the image of God. Therefore, under Marxism, your identity is derived from the system, and the system has total power to decide what you can and cannot do. That is why Marxism is so dangerous, because Marxism equals control. Marxism says we're going to give you your identity. But if we give you your identity, we're going to be able to control your identity, control what you can and cannot do. We have freedom. We've been set free through Christ's saving sacrifice. We cannot go back into slavery. And we need to shine a light so others can also see the way out of darkness, out of bondage, into the light, into the life offered through Jesus Christ. Friend, I want to remind you that we have hope not in a system, but a Saviour. And that is why Marxists want to destroy Christianity. Communism cannot stand competition. And remember, Marxism is a step before communism. Communism doesn't accept competition. That is why they want to eliminate Christianity, because they see Christianity as competition for the minds and the hearts of the people. The old Freemason Joseph de Maistre reasoned that although nations had been historically conquered by military invasion, they could also be destroyed without an invasion by encouraging internal decomposition and corruption. The Frankfurt School's belief was that as long as individuals had hope of solving society's problems, there could never be a successful socialist revolution. And so in their view, to succeed with their plans, society needed to be deprived of hope and utterly alienated. They reasoned then that this dilutes and destabilises underlying Christian principles and ethics. Now, how do you remove hope from people? Number one, you detach them from the hope of Christianity. Two, you make them think that society is against them. Remember, under true Marxism, it was supposedly the working class which would be the agents of revolution. And since the working class was too comfortable, another group had to be found. But in order to be manipulated to rise up, you would have to convince people they are oppressed. So they set about creating conflict between society and minorities so that there would be groups of people that they could manipulate against the ruling class in order to drive the change that they so desired. Anyone they could manipulate into believing they were an oppressed minority, they would use. Now, I'm not saying that some minorities don't have legitimate concerns over how they've been treated in society. Of course they do. It is just that you need to be careful to differentiate between true oppression and manufactured oppression for the purposes of manipulation. Well, can I say in our brief time that concludes our look at the 1920s. Lots happened in the 1920s. Birth of some new ideas, some very dangerous ideas. And then next time we're going to look at the 1930s. And this was a pivotal time when the events of the world seemed to spiral out of control. And the neo-Marxists, well, they scrambled to adapt to a dynamic global situation which threatens their plans. Will they still be able to carry out their plans, or will their plans crumble? We'll see next time, but as we well know, 100 years later, we know that there was a rebirth of their ideas, and we'll come to know exactly how as we go through the 1930s. So until next time.